Hey, here are 5 stupid things I've noticed about libertarianism.
Oh, you've noticed 5 whole stupid things about libertarianism? Well, please do share, good sir.
It's selfish.
Really? I must admit, I am rather curious what's selfish about an ideology that believes you should be left alone if you aren't hurting anybody.
Libertarianism, like most political philosophies, is an old house with many rooms. For the purposes of this video, I'll be limiting myself to libertarianism as it is most commonly found in American politics today. Consequentialist, capitalist, and individualist.
So you're not going to consider the deontological or philosophical aspects of it? I have a feeling it's for a reason.
In character. The defining characteristic of this form of libertarianism is selfishness.
Actually, it's non-aggression and peaceful coexistence. But go ahead and go on with your straw man.
Libertarian thinkers and politicians, note the distinction.
Credit where credit's due. He is acknowledging the rather important distinction between libertarian politics and libertarian philosophy.
Are capable of reciting some very impressive sounding rhetoric about individual liberty and freedom of association.
Do you understand the underlying logic behind those concepts? Since you're dismissing them as rhetoric, I have a feeling you don't.
But it all reduces to this. I want to be left alone, and I want things my own way.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break!
Actually, it all reduces to this. All interactions should be voluntary. That being said, we think everybody should be left alone who wants to be left alone. We want to have things our way? Well, no shit, Sherlock. Everyone wants to have things their way. The difference between you and I is, I want to seek out peaceful means to have things my way, whereas you seem to want to use threats and coercion.
Just think how many resentful 5-year-olds are libertarians without even realizing it.
Actually, I think most people are libertarian without even realizing it. You see, the non-aggression principle, the core idea that libertarians universally believe, basically says it's wrong to hurt people. So the shit that you're taught and understood since age 5 is basically what libertarianism is. The only difference between most people and those who identify as libertarian is that we understand that that applies to government too. And before I continue, real quick, I'd like to take a moment to address that picture in the background. Now, I believe the message it's trying to get across is that a political system shouldn't be based on greed. And well, first of all, libertarianism isn't based on greed, it's based on lack thereof, as I've just explained. Many libertarians do support charity, but also greed is something that's always going to exist in every society regardless of what political system you use. Instead of pretending it doesn't exist, advocates of free market capitalism say let's harness it.
It alienates people from the government.
All we simply do is point out the fact that government is just made up of people, like you and me, with no special powers or abilities or benevolence. If the result of this conclusion makes you feel alienated, that's on you.
Libertarians have all sorts of ominous-sounding ways of referring to the government. The beast, Big Brother, the state, with the S capitalized to look extra totalitarian. Most, if not all, libertarians view the government as the enemy of the people. It's written and spoken of as though it were some malevolent alien that has attached itself to our civilization, from whose tentacly clutches we must all constantly struggle to escape.
You act like there's no reason to be skeptical of trusting the government whatsoever. Arbeit macht frei, my dude.
But the thing is, a constitutional, democratically empowered government, like the one we have in the United States,
yeah, don't make me laugh,
doesn't have to be the enemy of the people.
I'll agree that there are some good things that could come from government, but do you think anarchists should be allowed to opt out?
It can actually be the most powerful and effective tool of the people.
Now, when you say the government can be an effective tool for the people, what exactly do you mean by that? A tool to be used to what end? Can you give us some examples of how the government can be useful to the people? Do you think there's anything less coercive in the toolbox that may also do the trick?
Unfortunately, most politicians with libertarian leanings seem like they would rather sabotage the government than work to make it better and more effective.
I'm telling you, I'm sabotage!
The problem is you're using a lot of vague terminology here. Sabotage could simply mean any change I disagree with, and making something better and more effective can simply be any change I do agree with. What would bolster your argument here would be to give us some specific examples of some libertarian policies that you disagree with, what harm you foresee them causing, and what alternative policies you think would be better.
Which is really shitty to those of us who agree with Abraham Lincoln on the whole of, by, and for the people thing.
Well, nobody's saying people who want government can't have it, just let the anarchists opt out. Again, I'd like to analyze the picture in the background real quick. This seems like some sort of an attempt to paint libertarian candidates as hypocritical for being critical of and wanting to be in charge of government, but I believe that taking initiative upon itself to make any changes you feel are necessary is anything but hypocritical. Of course, people who criticize government would be in the best position to decide what changes are in order.
It's anachronistic. Most of the major expansions and reforms of government that libertarians resent and wish to dismantle, the Federal Reserve, Social Security, Medicare, the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, etc., were brought about because there was a recognized need for them.
The assumption here being that all legislation comes from legitimate necessity and not the ulterior motives of any given politician. But even if the problems that this legislation seeks to address are legitimate, that still doesn't necessarily mean that legislation is the best way of going about dealing with these problems. There may be other, better, more effective ways out there. To help get my point across, I'll discuss each of your examples further, starting with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has resulted in our country being dependent upon a currency which is constantly losing value and based on debt. Social Security puts the elderly and vulnerable at the mercy of what's essentially a Ponzi scheme. Medicaid has mostly resulted in an increase in healthcare costs rather than a decrease. And while the Civil Rights Act and ADA have had the intention of giving certain groups of people better opportunities, they've ultimately had the effect of further marginalizing the people they're intended to protect.
Societies grow and evolve, and so do the needs and interests of their members.
But do you know what doesn't grow and evolve too well? Government. It's true that people's needs change frequently, and a political or economic system needs to be flexible enough to adapt to those changing needs. The thing about a government, especially a complex bureaucratic one like the one you have in mind, they're slow as molasses when it comes to change. The only economic system that's been able to adapt to the ever-changing needs of members of society, and do so consistently well, is the free market.
Even so, many libertarians often express a desire to roll things back to how they were once upon a time.
Most of the progress that's happened over the past 100 years has been largely the result of the free market. Government intervention had little, if anything, to do with it. Rolling back government power isn't the same as regressing society. Nice attempt to paint a false dichotomy, though.
In some cases, all the way back to the day of the Founding Fathers. And this is perfectly understandable as I see it, because you would have to go back that far to find a point in American history where their ideas would have formed the basis of a sound political system rather than a failed and useless ideology.
Actually, you wouldn't. There are examples of successful libertarian societies that exist today. Hong Kong went from a resource-barren island to one of the most wealthy countries on the planet in less than 50 years, thanks to low taxes and low regulations encouraging business development. The quality of public infrastructure in Somalia actually improved once their government was disbanded. And although Sweden does have a generous welfare state, they're able to maintain this at a low tax rate due to their strong economy. So you don't really have to look far to see successful examples of libertarianism in action.
It puts on airs.
She wears a hat full of air.
Do you mean she puts on airs?
I guess so.
I'm an atheist.
Well, you believe in authoritarianism, so I doubt that.
And I know as well as anyone that we can be some condescending bastards when we want to be. But let me tell you something. When it comes to intolerable smugness, an atheist has got nothing on a libertarian.
Libertarians are smug, huh? Well, we don't think our ideas are good enough that they have to be imposed on people by coercion against their will. So if that makes us smug, I'm not sure what that makes you.
Unless the atheist in question happens to be a libertarian, which is not uncommon.
Well, both libertarians and atheists reject the idea of there being an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent entity.
Look, the point is this. Many libertarian politicians and commentators like to cultivate this image of intellectual superiority for themselves and their political philosophies.
Yes, we do believe our political ideologies are intellectually superior, hence why we don't think we need violence in order to back them up.
Unlike, say, liberals or non-libertarian conservatives, a libertarian roots his ideals firmly in the soil of reason.
Yep, that's true. Libertarians take the same approach to politics as scientists and mathematicians do to their fields. Start with basic logical axioms, things that you're guaranteed to be true, and from that carefully reason and build your belief system up. So let's start with something that we know to be true. What's the number one rule in logic? Non-contradiction. A premise and its negation cannot both be true. From this we get the consistency principle. Because all contradictions are a priori false, in order for an argument to be true, it has to avoid contradicting itself. It has to be consistent. And from that we get self-ownership. Ownership is defined as the ability to exert one's will completely over something. And if you couldn't exert your will completely over your will, then it wouldn't be your will. So you would both own and not own yourself, which is a contradiction. So in order to be consistent, in order for the concept of ownership and will to work, it has to be the case that you own yourself. And if you own yourself, then that means that nobody else can own you. Because again, if you owned yourself and somebody else owned you, you'd both own and not own yourself, which would be a contradiction. This is why slavery is wrong. And since slavery is wrong, you also have to have property rights. If it's wrong for me to take advantage of your time and labor directly, why would it be any better after the fact? This is, of course, a highly condensed version of what is a complex logical chain, but it's sufficient to get the idea across that libertarianism, unlike many other political ideologies, is based on a careful chain of logic, much like mathematics or science.
Libertarians are not swayed by appeals to emotions.
Yeah, neither is reality. Sure, a system where people are entitled food, housing, healthcare, and other essentials sounds good. It may make you feel good thinking about it, but here's the thing. The resources to produce all that have to come from somewhere.
They care not for what is popular or fashionable.
Again, neither does reality. An idea that may be popular or fashionable may still ultimately be worthless because it's impractical and infeasible.
Or empathetic, or humane, or fair, or... Look, you get the idea.
Actually, you don't. Or at least Mr. Shives doesn't, because he seems to be confusing our economic realism with selfishness or apathy. We don't oppose welfare and wealth redistribution programs because we're selfish, or because we don't give a fuck about the poor. It's because we apply economic theory and look at the long-term results and formulate better ways of accomplishing the same goal. Freer economies typically have more opportunities, therefore less poor. Also, each individual has on average more disposable income, which means there's more on average charity and humanity spending.
The point is they're above all that.
Yes, we are indeed above using false dichotomies to try and paint anyone who disagrees with us as selfish or apathetic. And again, I'd like to address the picture in the background, because this is a common talking point we hear from welfare statists. Well, what if charity isn't enough? Well, I don't know. Put your imagination to work. Come up with something. You could start a business and then funnel the profits into whatever charity you support. You could innovate to find easier ways of producing essential things so that poor people can afford them. There's more solutions to every problem than point guns.
Which brings me to the last stupid thing I'll mention about libertarianism. It's naive.
Libertarians are naive, huh? That's funny coming from someone who advocates for giving certain people special power and authority over everyone else and just expecting them to be ethical.
Yes, besides being outdated and buffoonishly pompous, libertarianism is also inescapably naive, since it assumes that, given maximum personal and economic freedom, individuals would just sort of work out an ideal or at least improved society for themselves.
Yep, and we have data to back it up.
Never mind that democratic government represents an attempt to do exactly that sort of thing.
Actually, democratic government is the ability of the majority to run roughshod over the minority. What we have in mind is more the majority can go do their thing, the minority can go do their thing, and then there everybody's happy. For example, in a libertarian society, you would be free to go start a democratically operated commune on your own property, where the majority goes. The minority in that case would still have to have the option to opt out, though.
Suppose not everyone in this minimally governed free market society was all that ethical.
We don't believe that people will behave ethically absent the state. We just think the state is a lousy way of dealing with that problem. Private courts and security, through the free market and through pressure from competition, will do a much better job at protecting people from those who would do harm.
Suppose, and I know this is hard to imagine, but bear with me, that those with the most wealth and resources decided that their private interests were more important than those of other individuals.
Well, in a free market society where all interactions are voluntary, they would have had to have taken care of the interests of others in order to obtain those resources.
Or of society as a whole.
Well, who gets to decide what's best for society as a whole? Society is a collection of individuals, each with unique needs and demands. You can't really apply an interest to all of society.
Libertarians will often caricature government in exactly this way, describing it as the powerful living off of the powerless with no concern for the welfare of those they exploit.
Well, you're obligated to pay government whether or not you like the service they provide. So there isn't really any reason for them to be concerned of your welfare.
And yet, the alternative that libertarians propose to this, which in their bitterness over having been born as members of a social species...
We're not bitter about being a social species. We recognize it full well. That's why we believe cooperation is superior to coercion as far as getting things accomplished goes.
...they perceive as tyranny at the hands of government is something that amounts to tyranny at the hands of unaccountable magnates.
Unaccountable magnates empowered by whom?
Minimum government, maximum freedom to those who can afford it.
Freedom isn't something you purchase, it's something you're naturally endowed with upon birth.
The hardest part is only picking 5.
Actually, the hardest part is doing research to figure out what it is that libertarians believe and what their reasoning is. It's clearly why you didn't do it. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.